The city stretched out beneath her like a glittering tapestry, streets threaded with headlights, rooftops catching the last gold of the sun. From the 30th floor of the Beaumont Tower, Clara could see it all, but she had never touched any of it. The penthouse was a world made of glass walls that reflected light in the day and turned to dark mirrors at night. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered views so wide they almost felt cruel. She could watch the ferries glide across the bay, see couples holding hands on the boardwalk, hear the faint hum of the city when the wind pressed against the glass. And yet she might as well have been watching another planet. Clara Beaumont had never walked a single step in her life. Her father, Richard Beaumont, a man whose name was whispered in corporate boardrooms and printed in glossy business magazines, insisted that the penthouse was the safest place for her. "Out there is chaos," he would say, gesturing vaguely toward the window. "Noise, risk, people who don't care if they hurt you. In here, you're safe." Safe. The word felt like a cage. Her days moved with the precision of a clock wound too tight. Breakfast at the long marble counter, just her and the soft rustle of the morning newspaper in her father's hands. Afternoon hours filled with online classes, private tutors, and occasional video calls from acquaintances she had never met in person. Evenings spent sketching in her journal, the only place she could spill the dreams she didn't dare voice aloud. But the one ritual Clara never missed was standing well, sitting in her wheelchair by the east-facing window at dusk. She would watch the city lights flicker on, one by one, as if the city itself was exhaling after a long day. From up here, people look small, almost fragile, and yet they seem freer than she could ever imagine. Sometimes she imagined herself among them, walking down the street in a simple sundress, hair loose in the wind, stopping to buy flowers from the corner stand. Sometimes she pictured herself standing at the water's edge, feeling the tide rush over her feet. But those were just daydreams. In reality, her legs had been useless since birth. Their muscles never taught how to carry her. Doctors spoke in careful tones about congenital weakness, nerve damage, and therapies that had all led to disappointment. Her father told her not to think about it. "You're not missing anything," he'd say. "Everything worth having is right here." And yet, every time Clara looked beyond the glass, she felt the opposite. She wasn't sure if she was missing the world or if the world was missing her. That evening, as the last rays of sunlight faded, she caught herself pressing her palm against the window. The glass was cold, solid, unyielding, and for reasons she couldn't explain, her heart ached not for the things she could see, but for the things she had never known. Far below, a figure on a bicycle cut across the street, a bundle of flowers strapped to the back. She didn't know who he was, but he was moving fast, freely, as though the world belonged to him. Clara followed him with her eyes until he disappeared around a corner. She didn't know it yet, but the boy with the flowers would soon become the first crack in her glass tower. The morning air was sharp with the scent of salt from the nearby bay, and Evan Holt's bicycle rattled against the uneven pavement as he made his way up the hill. He had been awake since before dawn, delivering newspapers in the cold mist, then bussing tables at the corner cafe before rushing to pick up this last job of the day. A flower delivery for the Beaumont estate. The bouquet sat in the wooden crate attached to the back of his bikin, extravagant mix of white lilies, blush roses, and pale blue delphiniums, wrapped in paper so fine it looked like it belonged in a magazine. The arrangement was too perfect, too expensive for him to imagine buying for anyone he knew. But he handled it with care all the same, because that was what he did. No matter how tired, no matter how little he had left in him, Evan always carried other people's beauty as though it mattered. The Beaumont estate came into view at the crest of the hill-tall iron gates, stone walls lined with manicured hedges, and the distant shimmer of glass windows high above. The place looked like it had been built to keep the world out, or maybe to keep someone in. He rolled to a stop in front of the gate, pushing down on the kickstand. His legs ached from the day's work, and his shoulders felt tight under the weight of exhaustion. A small intercom box was mounted on one side of the gate. Evan pressed the button, waited, and tried not to think about how much he wanted to collapse into bed. A static buzz crackled, followed by a clipped professional voice. "State your name and purpose." "Evan Holt," he said, clearing his throat. "Delivery for Mr. Beaumont. Fresh flowers." There was a pause long enough for him to wonder if they'd just ignore him, but then the gates hummed to life, slowly parting to allow him through. He pushed his bike along the gravel driveway, the crunch of the stones under his tires the only sound. The gardens on either side were perfect in their symmetry, the kind of beauty that didn't happen by accident, but by endless, unseen labor. Halfway up the drive, he felt it, that strange, prickling sensation, like someone's eyes were on him. He glanced toward the house, and there it was, a tall wall of glass reflecting the pale morning sky. At first it seemed empty, but then a shape shifted in the corner of one window. A shadow, no a figure. Someone was there watching. He slowed his steps, curiosity catching hold of him. Through the faint glare of the glass, he saw her, a young woman seated, her hair spilling over one shoulder like a dark ribbon. She wasn't moving much, just sitting very still, her gaze fixed on him as if she wasn't sure he was real. For a moment, Evan forgot the ache in his legs, the weariness in his bones. There was something in the way she looked at him, not like the usual, quick, dismissive glances of the wealthy toward the help, but with an intensity that made him feel seen. And then it happened, their eyes met. It couldn't have been more than a second, maybe two. But in that fragile space of time, something passed between them. Not a smile, not a word, just a flicker of connection, as if two completely different worlds had brushed against each other and realized, for one heartbeat, they were not as far apart as they seemed. She didn't look away. Neither did he. A cough from somewhere inside the house broke the spell. The figure in the window shifted back into shadow, and Evan was left staring at his own faint reflection in the glass. He delivered the flowers to a stiff-faced housekeeper who barely met his eye, then turned his bike around. The gate closed behind him with a heavy final clang. Evan didn't know her name, and he doubted he'd ever see her again. People like her didn't belong in the same sentences as people like him. But as he pedaled down the hill, he caught himself glancing back, just once, at the high glass windows. And far above, hidden in her penthouse, Clara Beaumont sat in her wheelchair, fingertips resting on the cold window pane, wondering why a stranger's gaze had made her chest feel warm for the first time in months. The day began warm and bright, the kind of summer morning that promised nothing but calm. The air shimmered faintly above the pavement as Evan pedaled toward the upper district, his delivery crates already half empty from the morning's orders. He had taken an extra job for the day, helping a local gardener tend to one of the sprawling estates on the hill. It wasn't his usual route, but the pay was good, and he needed every dollar. By noon, the sun was high, the sky a perfect expanse of blue, until it wasn't. It started with a faint shift in the air, and an almost electric weight that made the leaves whisper differently. The horizon darkened, clouds rolling in with unnerving speed. Within minutes, the bright sky was swallowed by a storm front, the first low rumble of thunder echoing across the bay. Evan had been trimming rose hedges near the edge of the Beaumont property when the wind picked up, whipping petals into the air. A jagged streak of lightning tore through the clouds, and instinct drove him toward shelter. The nearest refuge was a white-painted gazebo at the far end of the garden, half hidden by climbing wisteria and framed by neat gravel paths. He ducked inside just as the rain began, first in hesitant drops, then in a sudden, heavy curtain that blurred the world beyond the garden. The smell of wet earth and flowers filled the air, mingling with the metallic tang of the storm. For a moment, Evan just breathed, listening to the hammering of rain on the wooden roof. He thought he was alone, but then, somewhere behind him, a faint creak broke the rhythm of the storm. He turned. Clara Beaumont was there, framed by the garden path, her wheelchair moving slowly over the gravel. The thin wheels wobbled against the uneven stones, but she didn't stop. She had thrown a light shawl over her shoulders, though the damp air had already begun to cling to her hair. It had been years since she'd ventured beyond the glass confines of the penthouse, years since she'd felt the air unfiltered by walls. Something about the storm had drawn her out, an inexplicable pull she couldn't ignore. And now here she was, following it to the garden's far edge. To him. She hesitated at the threshold of the gazebo. "You'll get soaked out there," Evan said, his voice careful but not unkind. She glanced at him, this boy in worn jeans and a rain-spattered shirt, with a streak of damp hair falling into his eyes. He looked nothing like the people her father brought into their home. His presence felt raw, unpolished, real. "I'm not afraid of a little rain," she replied softly, though her voice carried the faint, practiced grace of someone who had grown up choosing her words carefully. Evan shifted, giving her space. She wheeled herself inside, the rain pattering harder now, wrapping them both in the strange intimacy of shared shelter. For a while neither spoke. The silence wasn't exactly comfortable, but it wasn't cold either. It was the quiet of two strangers listening to the same storm. Finally, Clara said, "You were here the other day with the flowers." He nodded. "And you were in the window." Her lips twitched, almost a smile. "You noticed?" "Hard not to," he admitted, meeting her eyes for the briefest moment before looking away. "Not every day someone looks at me like I'm worth noticing." That caught her off guard. Most people assumed she was the one invisible, hidden away in her father's tower. But here was this boy, speaking as if he knew the exact shape of being unseen. "I don't usually come out here," she said after a pause. "It's been a long time." "Why today?" he asked. She looked past him at the rain cascading off the gazebo's edge. "I'm not sure. Maybe the storm made the walls feel smaller." Evan studied her then, not in the way people looked at her with pity or polite curiosity, but with the direct, steady gaze of someone who actually wanted to understand. They were from different worlds. She could see it in the way his hands were rough from work, in the easy looseness of his posture, in the absence of the guarded polish that clung to her like a second skin. And he could see it too in the fine fabric of her clothes, the deliberate precision in her movements, the faint echo of loneliness in her voice. The storm raged on, but something softer settled between them, and an unspoken acknowledgement that they were both, in their own ways, trapped. When the rain finally began to ease, neither of them moved right away. The air smelled fresher now, the garden glittering with raindrops. Evan glanced toward the main path. "I should get back to work." Clara nodded, though something in her chest tightened. She had no reason to expect she'd see him again. And yet, as he stepped out into the damp gravel, she found herself watching him as if this moment might matter more than she could yet understand. Evan didn't look back, but the image of her in the gazebo, framed by wisteria and soft light, would follow him long after the storm passed. The storm had passed, but the garden still held its breath. Raindrops clung to every petal and leaf, trembling whenever the breeze wandered through. The world smelled of wet grass and earth alive, renewed. Clara found herself returning to the gazebo the next morning. She told herself it was just for the air, for the way the garden felt softer after the rain. But deep down, she knew it was also because of him, the boy who had stood here yesterday, quiet and unassuming, as though sharing space with her wasn't something unusual or difficult. She sat there for a while, letting the sun's warmth seep through her shawl, until a faint, uneven sound broke the stillness. It was the chime that hung just outside the gazebo, swaying gently in the breeze. Only instead of its usual clear music, it let out a dull, awkward clatter, like the wind was knocking on something that no longer knew how to answer. She frowned. The chime had been broken for months, maybe years. She'd stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a picture that's hung crooked for too long. Footsteps crunched along the gravel path. She turned and saw him, Evan, walking toward the gazebo, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, a coil of twine in one hand and a small toolkit in the other. "I didn't know you were here," he said when he reached the steps. "I didn't know you'd be back," she replied, surprised by how easily the words came. He gave a small shrug. "Gardner asked me to help clear some branches from the far hedge." His gaze flicked toward the chime. "That thing's been driving me crazy since yesterday." Before she could ask, he stepped up onto the gazebo's railing, steady and sure, and reached for the chime. The breeze tugged at it, making it swing, but his hands were quick. He examined the strings holding the metal tubes together, nodding to himself. "It's just the cord," he murmured. "Frayed all to hell. Won't sing right if the pieces can't move the way they're meant to." "You fix wind chimes?" "I fix a lot of things," he said, not looking down. "When you grow up with nothing, you either learn to mend what breaks or you go without." She watched his fingers work calloused but careful as he threaded the new twine, securing each tube so they hung evenly again. In a few minutes, he stepped back down, dusted his hands, and gave the chime a small nudge. It answered with a soft, rippling song, the kind of sound that made the air feel lighter, as if the breeze itself was smiling. "You should be able to hear the wind sing," he said simply, meeting her eyes. Something inside her shifted. The words weren't grand or poetic, but they felt like they were meant just for her, like he wasn't talking about the chime at all. And then, without meaning to, Clara smiled. It wasn't the polite, practiced curve of her lips she gave her father's business associates or the mild smile she offered to tutors. This one was unguarded, real. She felt it in her cheeks, in the faint warmth rising behind her eyes. It startled her. How long it had been since she'd smiled like that. Weeks, maybe longer. Evan noticed but didn't comment. He just nodded once, as though fixing a chime and pulling a smile from her were equally ordinary things. Then he stepped down from the gazebo and headed back toward the hedge, leaving the sound of the wind song in his wake. Clara sat there long after he'd gone, the music of the chime drifting through the air. It was a small thing, twine, metal, in a stranger's hands, but it lingered in her chest like the first note of something she wasn't ready to name. At first it happened by accident, or at least that's what Clara told herself. Evan would arrive in the mornings to help the gardener, trimming hedges, hauling away fallen branches, mending the little things no one else noticed, but that made the Beaumont estate look as flawless as it did. And somehow, his path always seemed to pass by the gazebo or the rose garden or the shaded stone bench near the fountain where Clara had begun to spend more time. They never spoke for long, just a few minutes here and there, but those minutes began to stretch, and before long, they became something else entirely. One morning, Evan found her by the garden wall, trying to reach a cluster of white jasmine blooms. Her wheelchair was angled awkwardly, her fingers just brushing the petals. "Here," he said, stepping in beside her. Instead of simply handing her the flowers, he braced his hand on the back of her chair and crouched. "Put your hands here, on my shoulders." She blinked, startled. "Why?" "Just trust me," he said. "Lean forward, a little more. Now, put your feet flat." Her legs felt like strangers to her, thin and stubborn, but his voice was steady, calm, like someone who'd spent his life steadying fragile things. "Good. Now push down, just enough to lift yourself a bit. I'll keep you balanced." Her breath caught as the pressure shifted through her arms and into her legs. She'd done this in therapy before, of course, always with a metal walker and a watchful, clinical voice counting seconds in a sterile room. But this was different. The air smelled of jasmine and fresh earth. The sun was warm on her hair, and the only count was the quiet beat of her own heart. She rose not fully, not even close, but enough that her weight shifted onto her legs for a second. Then two, and then she sank back into the chair, her pulse racing. "See?" Evan said, not with triumph, but with an easy certainty. "They can hold you, even if it's only for a little while." Clara didn't know what to say. No one in her life ever spoke about her body that way, as if it wasn't broken, but just waiting for her to trust it. From then on, their accidental meetings became routine. Evan would pause his work to talk to her, then offer some small challenge: a stretch, a shift in balance, a moment of standing while he steadied her with quiet patience. She began to look forward to them, though she told no one, especially not her father. Richard Beaumont would never approve of her being alone with a boy like Evan, someone whose hands were rough with labor, whose shoes carried the dust of the outside world. So she hid their meetings like a fragile treasure, something too precious to risk in the cold light of her father's scrutiny. And in those hidden moments, something inside her began to change. It wasn't just that she was standing, if only for seconds at a time. It was that she felt a small, fierce spark of control over her own body, her own choices. The garden stopped feeling like a gilded cage and started to feel like a place where something was quietly growing, something that had nothing to do with roses or hedges. One afternoon, as Evan held her steady beneath the climbing wisteria, she caught herself smiling, not because he'd asked her to, but because she wanted to. For the first time in her life, Clara was taking steps toward something, even if they weren't steps anyone else could see. The morning was unusually still, the kind of quiet that made every sound seem louder: the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of gulls, the soft roll of waves against the bay. Clara sat in the gazebo, her hands resting on the armrests of her wheelchair, her gaze fixed on the wooden planks of the floor. Today felt different. Maybe it was the sunlight slipping in through the wisteria, or the faint pull of determination that had been growing inside her over the past weeks. Or maybe it was simply because Evan was here, leaning casually against one of the posts, watching her like he was waiting for her to make the first move. "Let's try something," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp with focus. She hesitated. "You mean standing again?" "More than that," he replied. "I think you're ready to try a step." Her pulse quickened. Standing had been one thing, just a few seconds of balance with his steady hands to anchor her, but walking? That was an entirely different world. Still, she nodded. Evan moved in front of her, crouching so his eyes were level with hers. "All right, hands on my shoulders, feet flat. Don't rush, just feel the ground." She placed her hands where he indicated, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath her fingers. Slowly, she pushed herself up, her legs trembling almost instantly under her weight. The air felt sharper in her lungs as she rose, her body swaying. Evan's hands gripped her elbows firmly, keeping her steady. "You've got it," he murmured. "Now, right foot first, just a little forward." Clara focused, willing her leg to move. Her toes shifted, her knee bent, then her muscles gave way. Her body pitched forward before she could catch herself. Evan caught her easily, the fall broken by his arms, but the impact still left her breathless. The moment she felt the seat of her wheelchair beneath her again, the frustration hit sharp, hot, impossible to hold back. "I can't," she said, her voice tight. "It's pointless. I'm not going to walk. Not now. Not ever." Evan crouched in front of her again, not moving, not speaking for a long moment. His expression didn't carry pity. There was no softening, no poor you in his eyes. Instead, there was something steadier, heavier. "You know what I see?" he asked finally. She shook her head, staring at the floor. "I see someone who just stood on her own two legs for almost 10 seconds. I see someone who didn't quit the second it got hard. I see more strength than you're willing to admit you have. Clara's throat tightened. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not her father, not her doctors, not even her therapists. Everyone else had always handled her like glass, afraid she'd shatter. Evan was the first to look at her like she was built to endure. You fell, he continued, his tone softer now. But that's not the part that matters. What matters is you got up in the first place. She met his gaze then, and something unspoken passed between them. An understanding that went deeper than the attempt itself. The failure still stung, but beneath it was a flicker of something stubborn. Maybe she wasn't ready to give up after all. As Evan stepped back to give her space, the chime above them sang in the breeze a reminder that even broken things could be coaxed back into music. The night before her birthday, Clara couldn't sleep. Birthdays in the Beaumont penthouse were quiet affair, expensive gifts wrapped in flawless paper, a dinner in the private dining room, polite toasts from her father's business partners. Nothing ever felt personal. Nothing ever felt hers. The clock on her wall read 4:52 a.m. when she heard Ida faint tap against the glass balcony door. She wheeled over, heart quickening, and found Evan standing outside in the dim pre-dawn light. He was dressed in a hoodie and jeans, hair tousled, a conspiratorial grin tugging at his lips. "What are you doing here?" she whispered as she unlocked the door. "It's your birthday, isn't it?" She blinked. "How do you?" "Garden gossip travels fast," he said with a shrug. "Come on, I've got something to show you." Before she could protest, he'd rolled her chair through the balcony doors, across the quiet terrace, and down a narrow ramp she'd never known existed. The estate was still asleep. No housekeepers, no gardeners, no watchful eyes. "Where are we going?" "You'll see." The air grew cooler as they made their way down a hidden path lined with seagrass. Clara could hear the low, steady roar of waves before she saw them. And then suddenly, the path opened up. The beach stretched before them, pale sand rippling under the wind, the horizon painted in soft strokes of pink and gold. The tide slid in and out like the slow breath of the earth. Her breath caught. She had seen the ocean every day from her window, but she had never been here. Never been this close. Evan guided her to where the sand was firm and damp, then crouched down in front of her. "Take off your shoes." She hesitated. Trust me." His hands were warm as he loosened the straps of her sandals, sliding them off and setting them aside. Then he carefully lifted her feet, one at a time, and pressed them into the sand. The sensation was unlike anything she'd known. The cool grit sifting between her toes, the faint pull as the water's edge lapped and receded. She let out a soft, startled laugh. "I've seen this my whole life," she murmured, "but I never thought—" Her voice trailed off, choked with something she couldn't name. "Happy birthday," Evan said quietly. For a moment, the world was only this, the salt air on her skin, the golden light climbing higher over the water, and the gentle rhythm of the waves. She wasn't Clara Beaumont, the girl who couldn't walk, the girl hidden in the glass tower. She was just Clara. Evan stepped behind her, lifting her under the arms. "Stand with me," he said. She rose, her legs trembling but holding, his steady presence anchoring her. Together they stood at the edge of the tide, the waves curling around their feet. The first full ray of sunlight spilled over the horizon, and she closed her eyes, letting it warm her face. In that fragile, perfect moment, she forgot the weight of her limitations. She wasn't thinking about what she couldn't do, only about the miracle of what she was feeling right now. And though she didn't realize it, Evan was watching her with something unspoken in his eyes, something that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with the way the light seemed to choose her. The beach morning had felt like a secret the world would never touch, just hers and Evan's. But 2 days later, that illusion shattered. It started with a muffled conversation outside her room. Clara was reading when she heard the sharp edge of her father's voice in the hallway. Then the door burst open. Richard Beaumont's tailored suit was immaculate, but his expression was thunder. He held a tablet in one hand and slammed it down on her desk so hard it rattled the glass vase beside it. "Explain this." The screen displayed a photo Clara, barefoot in the sand, wind in her hair, eyes closed as sunlight washed over her. Evan was behind her, his hands steadying her. It was beautiful. It was real. And it wasn't supposed to exist anywhere but in her memory. Clara's mouth went dry. "Where did you?" "It's all over the internet," Richard snapped. "Some local blog picked it up. The reclusive Beaumont heiress seen on beach. Do you have any idea what this does to our privacy? To your safety?" Her pulse pounded in her ears. "It was just one morning. No one." "You went outside without permission," he cut in. "And with him." The word him dripped with disdain. "He's been coming here under false pretenses. That ends now." She felt the air leave her lungs. "You can't. I can. And I will." Richard's voice was cold, final. "He is not to set foot on this property again. If you see him, if you speak to him, there will be consequences." Clara gripped the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles ached. "He was helping me," she said, her voice trembling. "He's the only one who—" "This discussion is over." He turned and left, the door closing with the heavy click of the lock. Clara sat frozen, staring at the photo still glowing on the tablet. The ocean behind her looked infinite, but now it felt impossibly far away. That night she pressed her forehead to the glass wall of her room, scanning the gardens below for any sign of him. But Evan didn't come. And in the hollow quiet, she felt something inside her crack not from the loss of freedom, but from the sudden, aching absence of the boy who had shown her the world could be more than glass. Evan didn't plan to stop seeing Clara. In fact, for the first few days after Richard's ultimatum, he walked by the Beaumont estate more than once, half hoping, half dreading that she'd be by the window. But then the truth found him uninvited, ugly, and sharp enough to cut through the warmest of memories. It happened in the back of the old hardware store where he sometimes unloaded shipments for extra cash. He was stacking crates when Mr. Alcott, the store's owner, squinted at him. "You're that boy," Alcott said, "the one whose father, you know." Evan straightened. "What about my father?" Alcott hesitated as though deciding whether the past was worth reopening, but then he sighed and the words spilled out. "He used to work for Richard Beaumont. Good man. Loyal. Then one day the papers said he'd been caught siphoning company funds. Fired. No references. No one would hire him after that." Evan's chest tightened. "My father didn't. That's the thing." Alcott leaned closer. "Everyone who knew him believed he was set up. But you can't fight a man like Beaumont. Your dad, he never recovered. Neither did your family." The crates blurred in Evan's vision. His father had never told him the details, only that life had changed when Evan was too young to understand why. But now the pieces clicked into place. The missed mortgage payments, the secondhand clothes, the quiet shame in his father's eyes. And all of it, if Alcott was right, began with Richard Beaumont. That night, Evan sat in the tiny kitchen of his apartment, staring at the cracked tiles while his mind replayed every moment with Clara. Her laughter at the beach, her frustration in the gazebo, the way her hands trembled the first time she stood with his help. She wasn't her father. He knew that, but she was part of that world born behind the very walls that had crushed his own family. When he finally lay down, he made himself a promise he wouldn't go back. Not until he figured out what to do with the tangled mess of anger and affection coiling in his chest. Because right now, every step toward Clara felt like a step into dangerous territory, one that could break them both. And so, the garden paths grew quiet. The wind chime in the gazebo sang to no one, and behind the penthouse glass, Clara kept searching the gates, not knowing the reason for his silence was a wound far older than either of them. The days after Evan's disappearance stretched into something heavier than loneliness, something closer to a slow suffocation. Clara stopped wheeling herself to the window. The garden, once a secret stage for small victories, felt like a cruel memory now. She no longer practiced standing. The muscles in her legs, which had begun to wake under Evan's gentle persistence, grew stiff again. Her father noticed, but only in the way someone might notice a wilting plant in the corner of a pristine room. "You've lost your spirit," Richard remarked one morning over breakfast, his tone detached, like it was a minor inconvenience. Clara only stared at the untouched toast on her plate. She told herself not to care. Evan had left without explanation, without goodbye. That should have been enough to bury whatever fragile hope she'd been holding. And yet, she kept remembering his voice. "You have more strength than you know." One night, unable to sleep, Clara rolled toward her father's study. The door was slightly ajar, the light spilling across the hallway carpet. She heard the low murmur of his voice, steady and businesslike. "Yes," Richard was saying into the phone. "The facility is ready. She'll have full-time care doctors, security, everything. No more unsupervised outings. This is for her own good." Clara's hands tightened on her wheelchair's armrests. He wasn't talking about care. He was talking about confinement, an even smaller world than the penthouse, a place where the sky would be a distant memory. She backed away from the door, her heart pounding. In the days that followed, Richard's gaze seemed to follow her more closely, as if measuring the right moment to act. And in the silence between them, shadows grew, shadows of doubt, of fear, of the terrifying possibility that soon she wouldn't just be alone, she would be gone. And if Evan didn't come back, no one would even know where to find her. Evan had spent weeks avoiding the Beaumont estate, letting his anger keep him away. But the truth, when it came, hit like a tidal wave. It was his grandmother who told him, her voice trembling with the weight of years. "Your father, he wasn't ruined by Richard Beaumont. He chose to take the fall." Evan stared at her, confused. Why would he do that? She explained in fragments, a scandal years ago, a contract gone wrong, and whispers that could have destroyed Richard's reputation. Evan's father had stepped forward, accepting blame so the Beaumont fortune and influence could remain untarnished. In return, Richard had promised to look after their family. But after his father's death, that promise had vanished into silence. Evan's anger shifted into something sharper, betrayal, yes, but also guilt. Clara, she had been alone all this time, while he'd walked away without giving her the chance to explain. By the time he reached the gates of the Beaumont estate, the sky was dark, heavy with the threat of rain. The guard stepped forward, shaking his head. "No visitors after." "I'm not a visitor," Evan cut in, his voice low and steady. "I'm here for Clara." When the guard hesitated, Evan pushed past, striding across the manicured lawn. The lights in the penthouse window were on her light, the one she once told him she kept burning, so the night didn't feel so endless. He found the service elevator and took it all the way up, ignoring the shouts behind him. Clara was in the living room, her wheelchair facing the glass wall, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond. She turned at the sound of the door bursting open. For a moment, disbelief froze her in place. "Evan? I should never have left," he said, his voice breaking just enough to make her heart twist. "I know everything now, about my father, about yours. And I don't care what's between our families. I'm not letting him lock you away." For the first time in weeks, the air in that glass tower felt alive. And for the first time in years, Clara felt something stronger than fear. She felt the walls inside her begin to crack. The rain had begun by the time Evan closed the penthouse door behind him, but neither of them noticed. Clara's breath was unsteady, her hands tightening on the armrests of her chair. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "If my father—" "Then let him see," Evan said firmly. "He needs to know you're not something to keep hidden. You're stronger than he's ever let you believe." She swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the polished floor, then to the window where the storm streaked across the glass. "Evan, I tried. I failed." "Horna, then try again," he said, crouching so his eyes met hers. "Not because I'm asking you to, because you want to." It was only then that she realized how much his presence anchored her. Without him, her fears had felt like chains. With him, they were just knots that could be untied. Slowly, she gripped the arms of the chair and shifted forward. Her bare feet touched the cool floor, toes curling for balance. She took a breath, every muscle trembling, and rose. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't easy. But she was standing. Evan's hand hovered near her waist, not touching, not holding, just there if she needed him. "One step," he murmured. Her left foot moved forward. Her right followed, shaky but certain. The world around her blurred into the sound of her own heartbeat. Then a voice, sharp and disbelieving, cut through the moment. "Clara!" Her father stood at the threshold of the room, an umbrella dripping in his hand, his tailored suit damp from the rain. He had seen everything. For once, Richard Beaumont's face wasn't guarded or calculating. It was raw, almost vulnerable. His eyes flicked from his daughter's trembling stance to Evan's steady gaze. "You," Richard began, but the words faltered. Clara straightened, holding her balance for as long as she could, before sinking back into her chair. She was breathless, but there was a spark in her eyes he hadn't seen since she was a child. "I walked, Dad," she said softly, "and I'm not done yet." Evan glanced at Richard, but his focus never left Clara. In that moment, the power in the room shifted. For the first time, Richard Beaumont wasn't in control. Clara was. The rain outside had softened to a mist, the steady patter against the glass a fragile backdrop to the silence in the room. Clara sat in her chair, her breathing still uneven from the effort of those steps. Evan stood beside her, his posture tense, ready for whatever came next. Richard remained near the doorway, water dripping from the cuffs of his trousers onto the marble floor. His usual air of command was gone. His shoulders were hunched, his gaze fixed on the space between them, as if the truth he'd been hiding for years was finally too heavy to bear. "I never meant to." He stopped, his voice breaking in a way Clara had never heard. "To what?" Clara asked, her tone steady but edged with years of suppressed hurt. "Control me? Keep me locked away? Decide what my life was worth?" Richard's eyes lifted to hers, and for a moment, he looked older, like the man behind the empire, stripped of all the armor. "To hurt you," he said quietly. "Everything I did. It was because of what happened when you were little." Clara frowned. "What happened?" Evan glanced between them, sensing the weight of something unspoken. Richard's jaw tightened before he forced the words out. "It was my fault. The accident. The reason why you lost so much of your mobility." His voice cracked again. "I was rushing, late for a meeting. I didn't see you run toward the street. I pulled you out of the way, but too hard. You hit the steps. The doctor said you'd recover more, but you didn't because I pushed you too far in rehab. I made it worse." The confession hung in the air like a storm about to break. "You've been keeping me here because of your guilt," Clara said, each word slow and deliberate. "Not to protect me." Richard's breath shuddered. "I couldn't face the world knowing I'd broken my little girl. If I kept you here, I could pretend you were safe, that I hadn't failed you." His eyes glistened. "I thought I was keeping you from pain. Instead, I trapped you in it." Clara's hands tightened on the armrests. "You should have let me live, even if I fell. even if I failed again. You stole years from me, Dad. Richard stepped closer, but Evan shifted subtly, placing himself between them, not in challenge, but as a silent line of defense. I'm sorry, Richard whispered. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I'll do anything to make it right. Clara's voice trembled, but her words were clear. You can't give me back the time I lost, but you can stop deciding my future for me. For the first time, Richard didn't argue. He simply nodded, his eyes glistening with a helplessness that had never belonged to the man she knew. And in the quiet that followed, Clara realized this was the first real conversation they had ever had. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth from the night's rain. Sunlight broke through the thinning clouds, scattering gold over the estate gardens. Clara stood at the threshold of the great iron gates, her heart thudding louder than the distant hum of the city beyond. Her hands curled around the cool metal of her chair's armrests, but she didn't sit. She stood slowly, carefully, letting the weight settle into her legs. Every muscle trembled, but she refused to lean on anything. Behind her, the estate loomed like a silent sentinel, its high glass windows catching the light in a way that made them look like watchful eyes. The place that had been both sanctuary and prison for most of her life. Richard stood a few paces back, watching her with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. Not pride, not sadness, something more fragile, acceptance perhaps. You don't have to do it today, he said quietly, almost as if offering her a way out. Clara shook her head. I've already spent too many days waiting. The gates opened with a low groan, and beyond them lay the world she'd only glimpsed through glass. The pavement, the smell of fresh bread from a bakery across the street, the distant chatter of strangers who didn't know her name or her story. She took a step forward, then another. Each one was a battle. Her balance wavered. Her legs burned, but the pull of freedom was stronger than the fear of falling. She didn't look back. And then she saw him. Evan was leaning casually against a lamppost just beyond the gate, his hands in his pockets. No flowers, no grand gesture, just a steady presence. When their eyes met, he pushed off the post and walked toward her, stopping only when they were close enough for her to see the softness in his gaze. He extended his hand not to steady her, not to lead her, but to walk beside her. Clara looked at it for a moment before placing her hand in his. Warm, solid. For the first time, she wasn't leaving somewhere. She was stepping into something. And together, without hurry, they began walking down the sunlit street. Months moved with the steady rhythm of tide and routine. The city still wore its hurried face, but a small corner of it had softened around a new door. Where the boardwalk curved and the gulls made their morning arguments, Clara had opened a cafe that doubled as a gallery, a place that smelled like coffee and salt, paint and sugar. People stopped there not just for pastries, but because the place felt quietly and without fanfare like permission to be human. She named it simply, almost shyly, the Harbor Cafe. On the morning of the soft opening, she arrived before the sun was fully up. The light slid along the windows and across the worn wood floor, as if it were paying attention to the way things had been mended. She unlocked the door with hands that trembled the first time anyone had trusted them to do so. Her footsteps were deliberate, steadying themselves in motions she'd learned to trust. Inside, the air was warm with baking. Evan's grandmother, who everyone called May, moved around the tiny kitchen like she had always belonged to that heat. There was flour at the corners of her apron and a smile that creased into the corners of her eyes whenever she thought of the two of them. The counter displayed pastries in neat rows, buttered croissants, cinnamon twists, tarts arranged like little suns. A chalkboard announced the day's soup and the featured artist, Clara's own prints. Small studies of the bay she'd painted in the early, awkward months of recovery. Evan arrived with his bicycle slung over one shoulder, carrying a box of fresh loaves. He looked like someone who had finally learned what it meant to be home. When he saw Clara moving toward the front window, He took a breath that let him remember the long arc it had taken to get here. She met his eyes and smiled. It wasn't a smile that erased all the hard mornings. It was one that remembered them and still chose joy. She walked across the cafe floor that day, paused at the doorway to watch the sunlight pool on the street, and then went back to greet the first customers, friendly regulars who came for the bread and stayed for the quiet art talks. They called her Clara, like everyone else, no titles, no careful distance. When an older woman asked about one of the seaside sketches hanging above the espresso machine, Clara explained how she learned to look at water again, how the tide taught her patience. A group of college students clustered around a small table, listening to her describe a technique she'd improvised for capturing sunlight on wet sand. She answered the questions without pretense. If her steps faltered, if her balance wavered in the midst of a passing rush, she corrected herself and kept going. No one rushed to catch her the way they used to. They watched, steady and respectful, as she moved. May sent out trays of scones while humming old hymns under her breath. She kept one eye on the oven and one on Clara, and when she saw the younger woman steady herself by the counter and reach for a cup, she winked as if to say, "There you are." Washi. Customers loved the way May talked about life like recipes you could substitute sorrow for sugar. She would joke, "But you better know the measurements." The cafe became small evidence of a life earned not given. Local artists hung their works in rotating shows. Children came on field trips to paint shells they'd found on the shore. Evan taught a weekend class in simple carpentry in the back room, the kind that let people build things with their hands and go home with something they could touch. Clara ran a small afternoon program for neighbors who wanted to try drawing. She showed them how to find a single line in a complicated scene and follow it until it made sense. One rainy afternoon, a little boy from down the block walked in with a scraped knee and a wary look. He'd been watching the sea from behind his mother's coat, curious and quiet. Clara sat with him, took his hand, and drew a small, crooked boat on a napkin. "It doesn't have to be perfect," she told him. "It just has to float." He laughed, eyes bright with a new kind of mischief, and later left with a cookie May had slipped into his hand. It was a small thing, but it landed in both their lives like a practiced kindness. Not everything healed overnight. There were mornings when Clara still felt the old urge to retreat to the glass and hide. There were times when she fumbled through a sentence and felt the ghost of doubt. But each stumble was an instruction rather than a verdict. She learned to ask for help not as surrender, but as part of being in the world. Her father came to the cafe once. He stood outside for a long time, watching through the front window, as if he were a tourist at a familiar shore. When he entered, his steps were careful and measured. The conversation was soft and awkward at first, an exchange of two people learning how to share space they had been denied. Richard sat by the back window, ordered tea without milk, and left with a small loaf as if to test whether the world would still move. They were not fully reconciled. Some things were not undone by apology, but the wall between them had a new door, and that was progress. Evan's presence was steady but never possessive. He and Clara traded roles the way people who love each other do when they have years of practice ahead. Sometimes one of them led, sometimes the other. He carried crates and mended chairs, and she chose the playlist for slow Sunday mornings. They argued quietly about paint colors and debated the best ratio for a lemon tart. In the evenings, they walked the boardwalk together, side by side, not a rescue mission, not a performance, just two people deciding to keep walking. At night, when the cafe's lights dimmed and the chairs were stacked against the tables, Clara would linger in the window and look out at the water. She thought about the girl who had watched the world from glass, the person she had been, and felt an odd tenderness for her. She would never claim to have all the answers or to be finished. She had scars and stories and a body that still surprised her. But she also had a life she had chosen. On the morning of the cafe's one-year anniversary, they hung a small plaque above the door that read simply, "Open to everyone." Friends, neighbors, and strangers filled the room. There was no grand ribbon cutting, no speech to change the course of fate, only the hum of conversation, the clink of cups, and the steady presence of people who had witnessed one another through hard things. Clara moved through the room that day with a quiet confidence. She greeted faces, signed prints, and paused at the doorway to take in the scene the way the sunlight fell across May's flower-dusted hands, the way Evan laughed at something a customer said, the smallness of a world suddenly large enough to hold them all. This was not a clean, fairy tale conclusion. There were bills to pay, bad days and better ones, and memories that would always sting. But there was also choice, the hard, steady kind that demands you stand, step, fall, and stand again. Clara had chosen that life over and over, with a patience that taught her the shape of endurance. She had learned something simple and true, that walking was not only the movement of feet, but the decision to keep going when the map was not clear. Step by step, she had built a life that belonged to her. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a beginning. It was a life she had chosen, step by step.